This morning we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2. I'm going to read the text, and then I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive in. Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who was born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophets, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go, search diligently for the child, and when you found him, bring word that I too may come and worship him.' After listening to the king, they went away. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.' Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region, those who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet." This is the word of God. Let me pray. Lord, your word is powerful, and it is perfect, and it is glorious. And so now, God, we need you. We need you to open our eyes. We need you to behold your glory. We need you this morning to worship. We need you, oh God. Lord, I pray that right now, in this moment, would you remove from me every desire that longs to be impressive, and oh God, would you stand up in my body? Would you speak that which is pleasing to you, and oh God, would you be glorified? Would you lead us to worship? This text this morning is about worship. So draw us near, leave us in awe, allow us to be moved, for you are good. So Lord, we pray all of this in your perfect name, Jesus. His name was Wilhelm Conrad Rockton. Rockton, in 1901, won the Nobel Peace Prize on accident. He made a discovery while trying to do something else. During an experiment, he produced and detected electromagnetic radiation in a wavelength. Blah, 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 right? Rockton's rays however, are now used all over the world by doctors seeking to assess the health of their patients. They are used in securities and metal detectors. They are used in astronomy and material analysis. In a way, Roentgen rays, also known as X-rays, have changed the world. They allow us to see what is beneath the surface, to assess what is broken, to examine that which is hidden from plain view. They are necessary often for proper diagnosis. Well, this morning, I brought with me an X-ray. It may not be as big as the ones you are used to. It does not even take pictures, but it certainly helps us see what is beneath the surface. It helps us assess what is broken. It helps us examine what is hidden from view. I brought with me an X-ray. And yes, this morning we are going to see 3 hearts by use of this X-ray. We will see and examine their motives for worship. And we will seek to properly diagnose them. This morning we will X-ray Pharisees and scribes. We will X-ray a king. We will X-ray wise men. And finally, we will apply that X-ray to our own hearts. In this Advent season, we will examine our hearts and ask, are we hungry for the king to come? The scribes weren't. Herod wasn't. But are we? So, as you all have coined it, take a slow walk to the manger, may we do so with the wise men. And as we do so, may we examine our hearts. If I could, I would like to tag our text this morning, go get the X-ray. This morning, we will examine the heart of worship, and what we will see is that our view of God informs our heart of worship. So without further ado, let us dive into the text. We see verses 1 through 8. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him.'" Love that. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them, "Where is the Christ to be born?" They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. It fulfills the prophecy." They read the prophecy to him, and in verse 7, remember this, "Now Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship.'" In our opening scene this morning, we are introduced to 3 of the 4 characters that we will be examining. We have been introduced to wise men from the east. We've been introduced to King Herod. We've been introduced to scribes and Pharisees. And the turn of events that we are experiencing this morning are surely very strange. Wise men, also called magi, likely from Babylon or Assyria, which means that history tells us these are historic enemies of Israel. They are drawn west by something. These men of prestige and honor and wisdom enter into a foreign country looking for a new king. This couldn't have been a normal occurrence. Like, could you imagine? Powerful men from a different country and a different culture going to the White House to inquire about an unidentified next president. It would be all over the news. The stock market would dip. People would panic. Like, can you imagine a Russian delegation or a Chinese delegation pulling up to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with gifts, inquiring about not the current leader, but the next one? It may have been grounds for war, so are we surprised when the text tells us that Herod is troubled? And not just Herod, but all of Jerusalem is troubled with him. Deep in the annals of Herod's heart, anxiety began to fester. Fear began to creep in. Doubt began to flourish. And even with all of this, get this, his response on the surface seems reasonable. Doesn't it? He turns where every king of the Jews should turn in a moment of crisis. He turns to the religious leaders and he turns to the scriptures. We see in verse 4 that he assembles all the chief priests and the scribes and he inquires of them where the Christ is to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophets. He seems to be taking the news in stride. Not only does he welcome these magi, but he tells them, when you find this new king, come and tell me, because I want to worship too. At face value, Herod is a king and a leader that we would want to follow. He's open to new information. He's measured in his responses. He's seeking wisdom from experts. He seems to be the kind of leader who doesn't even want to overstay his welcome, maybe even humble. There's nothing at all concerning about Herod's leadership in these first 5 verses, but there is something concerning. If we examine the text, we should have a question. And that question is namely this: what happened to the Pharisees and the scribes? They show up in verse 5, give a prophecy in verse 6, but they're not in verse 7. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. Where do they go? They disappear from the text just as quickly as they were summoned. And as we pull out the x-ray, the first thing we examine is the heart of the scribes and the Pharisees. The first thing we examine is the heart of apathetic worship. Now, make no mistake, the Pharisees and the scribes were worshipers. Their whole lives had been given to intense study of the Torah. They had most of the Old Testament memorized. Notice they don't fumble around looking for the text. They pull it up immediately. Can you see them unraveling the ancient scroll and proclaiming Micah 5 to the king? And you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people. But then, where do they go? Why don't they go with the wise men? After reading this ancient prophecy about this promised king, they disappear back into their synagogues. What is happening here? Are you curious? No, there are so many prophecies. So many prophecies that predict this exact moment. They should have been on pins and needles. Genesis 49, Psalm 8, Isaiah 7, and when we get to Isaiah chapter 9, listen to what it says. Listen to the promise. For to you, or to us, a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. How could they read that and return to the synagogue? They have dedicated their lives to the scriptures that proclaimed a Messiah, the scriptures that pointed to a coming king, the scriptures that prophesied God with us. The child that was given to them would have the government placed on his shoulders. He would rule the nations. The child that would come would be called Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father, and Mighty God. And still, they could not be bothered. They told these foreigners where they could find the Messiah, their Christ, their king. They could not be bothered to go with them. As we observe what's on the x-ray, we see that they were passionate about knowledge, but not actually passionate about God. And as we examine the heart of apathetic worship, we see that there is a difference between religious worship and authentic worship. One has us at the center, while the other has God. The heart of apathetic worship views itself as equal to the God it seeks to get to, and therefore views worship as a bargaining chip or a transactional piece in order to get from God what they think they deserve. And you see them asking the question, why would we worship a baby? What can this baby do for us? We will just wait until he becomes king. In other words, they would worship him once they were convinced that he could give them something in return. Yikes. Don't we do this? Don't we withhold worship because we're not actually sure that God can give us the thing we desire? These self-serving worshipers figured they worshiped God later, when it was more mutually beneficial. For now, they were good with the king that they had. Y'all, we do this. We do this when we only pray when we need something. We do this when we open up our Bible to earn points with God. We do this when we only come to church to be inspired. Can I be honest? One of the things we say at Kingdom City is we pursue authenticity before God and one another. I found myself at my kitchen table repenting of this very thing this morning. My worship has been distracted. And worse, it has come with an agenda. Deep in the crevices of my heart, I have been giving God my worship, hoping that he would exchange it for good sermons. Deep in the crevices of my heart, I have been giving God my worship, hoping that he would exchange it for an established church. And he reminded me just this morning that a worship driven by what I get from him isn't worship at all. Who is at the center of our worship? Why are we here, right sitting where we sit? Do we want God for God or for what he can give us? These religious men had been to more Bible studies than all of us in the room combined. They knew more about Old Testament prophecies than the wise men could ever hope to know. But the wise men knew something about God that they did not. They were only 5 miles up the road from the Messiah they had long awaited, but they lacked curiosity, they lacked wonder, they lacked all, and they had boxed God into their intellect. They were at the center of their worship. Wise men knew something about God, about worship, that the scribes missed. The scribes and Pharisees thought they had something to give God, that they themselves were equal with God because they viewed themselves as self-sufficient. So as we pull out the x-ray, we see that their low view of God informed their self-sufficient bargaining chip worship. You see, X-ray reveals the heart of apathetic worship is a low view of God and a high view of self. And manifested in feeling like they deserved something from God, like we can demand from God. But here's the danger. The self-sufficient heart misses God every time. We see in the text, they didn't go. And worse, the self-sufficient heart in worship devolves to self-worship. This is what we see in Herod as we examine the heart of self-worship. As the story goes, God warns 2 people. First, he warns the wise men, go home a different way. And then he goes and he warns Joseph in a dream to take Jesus, the baby, and escape Egypt. Why? If you would, jump down with me to verse 16. We're going to move back up in a second. It says, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all in that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. We see that even though Herod presented well, even though his initial outward actions were altruistic, the inner motivations of his heart were desperately wicked. The calm, cool, collected Herod we encountered at the beginning of the text has devolved into a psychopathic, genocidal dictator. The text tells us when he realized he had been bested by the wise men, he became furious. He took no chances. He had every single male child in Bethlehem below the age of 2 murdered. Remember how carefully he questioned them? He knew all along it could come to this. There was no lengths that he wouldn't go in order to preserve his own interest and, get this, his own worship. What is going on in his heart? It's time to get out the x-ray. We see in the heart of Herod is hatred. But what is more condemning and should have us more cautious is that his hatred is directed toward God. He has a hatred for God who seeks the worship he feels entitled to. From the moment he heard that question, the question asked by the wise men, the question that waged war on the worship he craved for himself, that question, we see it in verse 2. Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him, not you. If we take an x-ray and place it over the text, what we see is that his heart is full of hate. He hated that baby who was born king and was still his worship. So when we pull out the x-ray, we see that Herod viewed God as opposition, and it led him to a self-centered worship. And under that hatred that festered in Herod's heart were the roots that are maybe a little more familiar to us. If we examine Herod's heart a little closer, we see that beneath the hate is the age-old plague of pride and the timeless infirmity of insecurity. He said in his pride, I should be king. And his insecurity said, you're illegitimate. His pride reminded him of all the momentous things and towers he had raised. His insecurity reminded him that the people didn't even care. His pride convinced him that he was worthy of worship. His insecurity caused him to kill babies. Can you see him tossed back and forth, to and fro, without a foundation between his pride that felt entitled to the worship that rightly belonged to God and the insecurity of knowing that he was not worthy of that worship his heart so inordinately longed for? As we examine the heart of self-worship, we see that it is motivated by something that is familiar to us. Unfortunately, we are more like Herod than we want to believe. Pride and insecurity are so compelling to us. They are both inadequate attempts to deal with the brokenness, the sin, the weakness, get this, that keep us from the worship we desire. Pride momentarily blinds us to our brokenness, and insecurity perpetually seeks to cover it. these not the two original sins from the garden? Did they not think they knew better than God and reach for the fruit in pride? And then were they not there to realize the inadequacy of their nakedness and insecurity? Our pride tells us that we are all we need. Yet our insecurity reminds us that we are not enough. Our pride tells us that the world should revolve around us, and our insecurity reminds us of how alone we feel in the world. Our pride leads us to judge others without any awareness of our own flaws, while our insecurities lead us to compare our weaknesses to other strengths on IG. Pride tells us that we deserve the future that we've envisioned for ourselves, but our insecurity insists that we will never have it. Pride and insecurity play tug of war with our souls. We too are pulled to and fro, dislocated from our sense of self, throwing us off balance, seeking worship, making decisions we regret. Am I alone? Isn't it exhausting? I have good news. It's good news that Herod did not want to hear. Friend, you were not made to be worshiped. You don't actually want the worship of your kids or your spouse or your boss or your friends or the strangers on social, because you weren't actually made for it. The good news of this text, when we look forward, we're going to see that we can actually drop the rope of pride and insecurity that play tug of war with our soul, and we can run to the one open-handed who is worthy of worship. Jesus is indeed the antidote for our self-worship. In him, we can accept that we are flawed. In him, we can accept that we are weak. In him, we can accept that we are not fit to rule, for he is the perfect one. Our pride can come and die. And in him, we are more loved than we could ever imagine, more seen than we could ever desire, more delighted than we can stand. My friend, you are fearfully and wonderfully made by your Creator. But you were not made to be worshiped, you were made to worship. Let your insecurity come and die there. This is glorious. This is the key to authentic worship. This is the only kind of worship that satisfies, because it is not apathy. It is not apathetic worship that leads to life. And it is not self-worship that leads to life. But it is authentic, God-centered worship that leads to life. So if you are tired of pursuing God in your own strength, if you are exhausted from seeking the worship of others, may I point you to the Magi. As we examine the heart of authentic worship, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship. They are recognizably different than Herod. They are recognizably different than the scribes. They do not cling to their own power or prestige, to their former position and influence or authority. These powerful men lay down their duties, lay down their comforts, lay down their privilege, and get this, they follow a star. The story is crazy. And the question is why? Maybe they had tasted the wealth and riches and found them lacking. Maybe they had received the praise of men and found it hollow. Maybe they had found the labors of cultivating worship for themselves exhausting. Maybe they were at the end of themselves, I don't know, but here's what I do know. Here's what we do see. Something caused them to stop seeking to be worshiped and worship the God who created them. It seems they were in search of something outside of themselves. Something different, something glorious, something transcendent. And here is the good news of the text, that when they looked outside of themselves, they found it. Under a star at the feet of a baby. So as we pull out the X-ray once more, for the final time, we see that it is a high value placed on Jesus that leads to authentic worship. We see this first and foremost because the wise men saw Jesus as worthy of their time. The wise men from the east would travel about 800 miles. To put that in perspective, that's from about here to Toronto. And they were not going 30 miles per hour, which would drive us crazy. Like, we would hate to drive to Toronto if traffic backed us up to 30 miles per hour. But they're not going 30 miles per hour. They're going 30 miles a day, which means that they could not get there in a day. They could not get there in a week. It would take them a solid month to go the distance. And what is their motivation, we may ask? It is not alliance. It is not even allegiance. It is worship. They are so drawn to this new king that they pack their bags and they go to a destination unknown to them. So you, O modern Christian, with the revelation of God at your fingertips, how far are you willing to go to find Jesus? We see in verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. I don't know about y'all, but this is good to me. They followed a star. Like, how do you do that? Right? Like, how do you follow a star? Go outside and try it tonight, right? But make sure your phone is charged because you're definitely getting lost. But this star had been called by its creator. It had been given the glorious task of leading worshipers to his front door. There was something different about this star. This star moved. Drawn like a magnet, held in orbit by the sun who spoke the solar systems into existence and didn't simply exist among them. This star pronounced the greatness of its creator and modeled humble submission to the wise men. This star vindicated the birth of the child that was shrouded in suspicion and validated his claim as king. Can you see what they saw? The king, exalted despite his obscurity. Can you see what they saw? This king, exalted despite his humility. When we place the X-ray over the heart of the wise men, we see hearts with eyes wide open to the glory of God. What do they see that Herod doesn't? What do they see that they long for that the Pharisees miss? They don't wait to worship. They see clearly. And not only did they abandon their quest for worship, they went in search of it for another king. What do they see? Two kings, one in a palace, one born in a manger. What do they see? Two kings, one surrounded by loyal subjects, the others by donkeys and goats. What do they see? One king watched by armed guards, the other watched by a star. What do they see? Two kings, one identified by power and prestige and pleasure, the other an infant in poverty. One king self-serving, the other came not to serve, but not to be served, but to serve. One king self-exalting, the other humbled but exalted. One king wrapped in pride and insecurity, the other God wrapped in flesh. Their hearts longed for something different, and they found it. They found what they were looking for, something worthy of worshiping. Verse 10 says, when they saw the star, I'm in my seat, y'all. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Their hearts had found the thing that it longed for, the thing it was created for. Can you see their worship? Verse 11 says, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and what did they do? They fell on their faces and worshiped him. And then can you see them scrambling? What can I have? What do I have to give? Oh yeah, I brought something. Here's some gold. Here's some treasure. Here's some frankincense. Here's some myrrh. Is he worthy, saints? Have you seen him in this way? The wise men, they see it clearly. They join Moses. They join Moses, who had beheld the glory of God. They join Isaiah. Isaiah, who when he saw him, he fell on his face. They joined the angels who proclaimed his glory in Bethlehem on that night. They joined the shepherds who ran to the mangers and fell on their faces and worshiped also. Their eyes had been opened to see his glory. My question is, have yours? Can you see it? As we place the x-ray over our own hearts, here's the question we want to answer. How do we worship? Or better yet, who? Who will we worship? With all that we have heard, I ask, is there another good option? Will we go the way of self-worship, the way of Herod? It requires getting rid of God. Is opposition an option? Herod tried to get rid of God, and Herod failed. God as an opposition is not a good plan. The way of Herod failed, and the way of Herod always fails. For decades and millennia, people have tried to do away with God, and yet decades and millennia later, he still sits on the throne, and he is still worthy of worship. But then is apathy a better option? If we fast forward 30 years, the scribes and the Pharisees are no longer apathetic. Their apathy turned to anger when he threatened their authority and autonomy. Their indifference turned to irritation when he healed the sick on the Sabbath. Their disinterest turned to disdain when he ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. Their passivity turned to pressure when they called the crowds to chant, "Crucify him." When asked in John chapter 9 by Pilate, "Shall I crucify your king?" the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." What a tragedy! Their self-serving worship led them to reject the king of their salvation for the king of their oppression. Will we do the same? They mocked him. They beat him. They tore the skin off his back. They refused to worship him. So they put nails in his hands. And they put nails in his feet. And they put a spear in his side. And they finished the job that Herod started. And they thought that they had won. They thought that they had defeated God. They thought, finally, we can ascend the throne for ourselves. Finally, we will be the ones worthy of worship. But I came here to tell somebody that victory over God is not an option. Because their triumph was short-lived. Their victory lap was cut short. For 3 days later, God got out of that grave. And he ascended into heaven. And he is seated on the throne. And he is worshiped in all of heaven. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that all power and honor and dominion and glory and majesty belong to our God. Belong to our King. Forever and ever. Amen. So then, if opposition is not an option, and apathy is not an option, and victory is not an option, there seems to be only one option left. It is the option of the wise man. That we would fall on our faces in worship. That we will turn and worship the God who came for us, the God who loves us, the God who died for us, and the God who is worthy of our worship, sitting in heaven. So, saints, as we worship now, will we worship with that in mind? Will we worship our true King, for he is worthy? Let me pray. Oh God, you are worthy of your worship. You are holy and you are perfect. You are tried and true. You sit right now, in this moment, in the heavens, with elders and angels casting their crowns before you. Oh, how we delight in your glory. How we delight in your love. Lord, would you help our hearts not to be apathetic or religious in our worship, not to be self-centered and self-seeking in our worship. God, we need you. We cannot do it in our own strength. Would you give us eyes like the wise men to see and behold your glory? For you are worthy to be praised. We praise you. We pray all this in your perfect name, Jesus.